The train station was nearly empty that afternoon, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. The benches were covered with a thin layer of dust, and the scent of coal smoke lingered in the air, clinging to the rafters like a memory that wouldn't leave. She sat in the far corner, her small suitcase tucked tightly against her legs, as though holding on to it might keep her from unraveling completely. Her eyes followed the people who came and went, wives leaping into their husbands' arms, children squealing as fathers scooped them up, sweethearts clinging together with laughter and tears. Every joyful reunion carved deeper into her chest the ache of being forgotten. 3 days. 3 long, humiliating days had passed since she had stepped off the train with hope tucked into her heart and a letter folded carefully in her pocket. The letter had promised that a man would be waiting, a man who needed a wife, a home, and perhaps, love. She had believed it. She had dressed carefully, pressing the creases from her one good dress, pinning her hair neatly, rehearsing the smile she would offer when he first laid eyes on her. But when the train hissed and the passengers disembarked, there had been no one holding a sign, no man scanning the crowd for her face. At first, she told herself he must have been delayed, that surely tomorrow he would come. But tomorrow turned into the next day, and the next. People began to notice the woman who lingered on the same bench, her suitcase untouched, her expression drifting between hope and despair. She told herself she would leave. She told herself she had endured worse disappointments and could endure this one, too. But her heart was not so easily persuaded. It clung to the fragile dream that maybe, just maybe, he would still appear. And so, she sat, her spine straight though her spirit wilted, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. The station master cast her a pitying look when he walked by, but he said nothing. Better to let her hope die quietly than to crush it with his words. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, and her throat ached from the effort of holding them back. She had thought she was ready for anything, a harsh man, a lonely ranch, a life of hard work, but she had not been ready for nothing. Nothing hurt worse than rejection that didn't even have the dignity of words. Just as her chest began to tighten, as though she might drown in the silence of it all, a small, clear voice broke through the heavy air. That's her. She blinked and turned, startled, her heart skipping. A little girl, no older than 6, stood at the edge of the platform, pointing directly at her with eyes as wide and bright as the sky after a storm. Her golden braids bounced as she hurried closer, her shoes clicking against the worn boards of the station floor. The child's face was lit with recognition, though the woman knew they had never met. The girl stopped in front of her, her cheeks flushed, her breath quick with excitement. "That's the one I told you about, Papa," the little girl said, her voice carrying through the station, filled with certainty that seemed far too big for such a small frame. Then, with a suddenness that stole the woman's breath, the girl asked, "Can you be my mama?" The woman's hands trembled where they rested on her skirt. She had been invisible for 3 long days, and now this child was looking at her as though she were the answer to every prayer. Slowly, almost afraid to shatter the moment, she reached out and brushed her fingers against the girl's cheek. Warmth spread beneath her touch, so real and immediate it threatened to undo her carefully held composure. The sound of heavy boots echoed behind the child, each step deliberate, weighted with meaning. She lifted her gaze and found herself staring into the eyes of a man who looked as though he carried the world on his shoulders. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun and nights filled with quiet burdens. A worn hat was clutched in his hand, his hair dark and slightly tousled from the wind. His eyes were soft, the kind of soft that could undo walls built over years of loneliness. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze holding hers with a mixture of apology and wonder. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the 3 of them, the abandoned bride, the hopeful child, and the man who seemed caught between past grief and unexpected hope. The silence stretched, heavy with things unsaid. He shifted his hat in his hands, clearing his throat as though words were too heavy to form. The woman searched his face, trying to understand. Was this the man who was supposed to meet her? Had he chosen not to? Or had fate simply tied their paths together in this strange, impossible moment? She wanted to demand answers, but the child's small hand slipped into hers, anchoring her in something far more immediate than questions. "Please," the little girl whispered, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "I've been waiting for you." The woman's heart cracked open. She had thought herself unwanted, cast aside, but here was a child who looked at her with the kind of belief she had once dared to hold for herself. She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill, and managed a trembling smile. The cowboy knelt then, setting his hat aside. His hand brushed over his daughter's hair before his eyes returned to the woman's. In them she saw regret, but also something else, something that felt like the faintest spark of recognition, as though he too had been waiting, though he hadn't known for what until now. She didn't speak, not yet. Words felt too fragile, too easily broken. Instead, she tightened her hold on the little girl's hand and let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in 3 days. The station that had been her prison of despair suddenly felt like the beginning of something she had never dared dream of. That evening the ranch house stood against the fading sky, its windows glowing with the soft light of lanterns. She sat at the kitchen table, her suitcase still tucked neatly in the corner, unopened, as if she did not yet dare believe she belonged here. The warmth of the fire crackled behind her, filling the silence with a steady rhythm, but it was the sound of the little girl's laughter that carried through the room, banishing the loneliness that had clung to her for so long. The girl had not left her side since the station. She held her hand as though afraid she might vanish if she let go, tugging her eagerly from room to room, pointing out every corner of the house that carried her memories. "That's where Papa reads to me," she said, showing her a small wooden chair near the fire. "And that's where Mama used to keep the pies." The words slipped out so easily, innocent and trusting, and though the woman's heart ached at the shadow of loss behind them, she smiled and nodded, listening with the patience of someone who understood what it meant to carry sorrow quietly. The kitchen smelled faintly of bread and wood smoke. On the table before her sat a simple supper, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pot of stew. She had offered to help prepare it, but the cowboy had insisted she sit and rest. His presence filled the space in quiet ways, never loud, never demanding. He moved with the certainty of a man accustomed to work, yet she could see the hesitation in his eyes whenever they landed on her, as though he was not sure how close he dared to stand, how much of himself he dared to offer. He had not spoken much since they arrived, but silence did not make him unkind. When his daughter's laughter rang out, his lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile that softened the hard lines of his face. When the little girl pressed her doll into the woman's hands, he watched with an expression that hovered somewhere between relief and fear. Relief, perhaps, that his daughter had found joy again. Fear, perhaps, that he might lose it if he reached too quickly for more. The woman felt those unspoken things pressing between them, and still she stayed. She stayed because the child's hand fit so perfectly into hers, because the warmth of the house eased the ache of the station's cold benches, because for the first time in years, she felt seen. The girl clambered into her lap, leaning back against her with the ease of a child who had already made up her mind. "You'll stay, won't you?" she asked, her small voice muffled against the woman's dress. Her throat tightened. She smoothed a braid from the girl's forehead, choosing her words carefully, though her heart already knew the answer. "If I stay," she whispered, "will you promise to keep smiling at me like this?" The girl giggled and nodded, wrapping her arms around her neck with the fierce grip only children possess. "Forever." The cowboy had been standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame as though to steady himself, but now he stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his boots. His gaze moved from his daughter's shining face to the woman's trembling smile, and something in him seemed to soften completely, as though a weight he had carried for far too long had finally been set down. He cleared his throat, his voice low, almost rough with the effort of speaking. "I should have met you at the station," he said. The words hung in the air like a confession. "Truth is, I wasn't sure I was ready. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake, that I was holding on to something I had no right to anymore." The woman looked up at him, her hand still gently stroking the child's hair. His eyes held hers with quiet intensity, and in them she saw the story he hadn't spoken, the grief of a man who had buried a wife too soon, the fear of letting another into the empty place she'd left, the longing he hadn't dared admit even to himself. "You're not a mistake," she said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. She had felt like nothing but a mistake for 3 long days, yet in this moment, holding the child who claimed her and meeting the man who had silently prayed for someone to ease his burdens, she believed her words. "And neither am I." The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. Not heavy, not painful, but alive, like a pause before something new. The cowboy moved closer, his boots stopping just beside her chair. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on his daughter's head. Then his gaze met the woman's once more, steady and unflinching. "If you'll stay," he said, the words rough but true, "you won't just be her mama. You'll be my heart, too." Her breath caught. Tears blurred her vision, but they were not the bitter ones she had fought at the station. These were tears of release, of hope she had thought lost. She pressed her cheek against the girl's hair, closed her eyes, and let the warmth of the moment wash through her. When she opened them again, she saw not a man holding back, but a man offering everything he had left to give. She smiled, small at first, then brighter as her voice steadied. "I'll stay." The little girl squealed with joy, wrapping her arms around both of them, her laughter rising like a song that filled the house with light. The cowboy's hand brushed against the woman's, as he held his daughter close, and though it was a simple touch, it carried a promise deeper than words. The house no longer felt strange. The suitcase no longer felt like a burden. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she felt that she had arrived, not at a place, but at a beginning. And in that firelit kitchen, with a child's laughter binding them together and a man's quiet strength anchoring them, she knew she had finally found the home she had been waiting for.